Hi, I'm Miss Hattie from Olympian High School. We'll be using the Traditions and Encounters textbook by Dr. Bentley to take a look at Chapter 40. We'll start on page 1151 in this section called Global Terrorism. So first of all, we need to understand that the word terrorism it's pregnant with meaning. It has a lot of connotations, and there is an often repeated phrase about terrorism. One person's or one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. So what we call terrorism differs based on who you ask. And what you might see as a terrorist organization, someone that espouses a different political ideology than you, might see as someone who's a liberator or who's fighting for freedom or fighting for the morally right thing to do. So there's going to be debate about what is terrorism, what is not. And the other thing I'm going to warn you about, since you've studied the Cold War, is that calling someone a terrorist or calling an organization a terrorist organization can be what's called a silencing technique or a silencing method. In the same way that during the Cold War, if you labeled someone who was fighting for something, if you labeled them a communist, there was a knee-jerk reaction to demonize them and to dismiss anything that they were saying, when sometimes they had valid arguments for what they were fighting for. So be careful. I don't like to see people quickly labeling something, either you're a communist or you're a terrorist, as a way of dismissing and silencing someone and not giving attention to what they are speaking about. So be careful when you hear people calling certain things terrorist organizations. Just use your critical discernment and your wisdom and patience and learning to try to figure out, what is this person doing, and do you agree with them or not? The one thing I will say that we can agree on in terms of the definition of terrorism is the deliberate use of violence against civilians to bring attention to a specific goal, whether it's a political goal of realizing a specific political goal or a religious goal, an ideological goal. It's a way of using violence specifically against civilians to magnify the impact of your power, since usually it's a weaker power, usually not associated with a state, either an individual or a group, against what's a much stronger state. Now, there's debate also about, can states use terrorism, and why, when the state or when a state uses violence, is that not called terrorism? And we could certainly look to many examples in history where states have condoned the use of violence against people, attacking people by dropping cluster bombs on them, say, as a way of pressuring a country into doing what they want. And why is that not called terrorism? Because a state actor is doing it, somehow it's condonable. So I'm not going to talk too much about that, because that opens up a space where we can debate and discuss what terrorism is and whether or not it's ever appropriate to use violence. Okay, so now we're going to tackle this tricky issue of terrorism. So the first thing you want to know is that this is something that's been a persistent feature throughout the globalized world, but it's especially heightened post-World War II. So after World War II, we see many different groups and individuals trying to draw attention to a specific cause, whether it's an anti-imperialism, anti-colonial cause, or if it's a nationalistic cause. So you can take a look at different, it's a religious cause, different areas in the world where we've seen heightened terrorist attacks. As I mentioned, it's the systematic use of violence against civilians, often with the aim of aiding a political, religious, or ideological cause. It might include hijackings, hostage-taking, assassinations, mass murder. And often it's a weaker power against a much stronger state actor. And you need many things to make this work. You need financial support, you need weapons supplies, you need a sanctuary to hide your fighters. And the difficult thing about dealing with terrorism is sometimes terrorists will be difficult to find because they're not representing a specific state. There are groups and individuals that hide. And also, there isn't always a coordinated response. And if there isn't a coherent, cohesive response from the international community, it's much harder to locate and deal with and prevent terrorist attacks. This issue of terrorism came to a head, especially became something of concern for the United States after the terrorist attacks of 9/11. 9/11 stands for September 11th of 2001. And you could do a lot of internet research to learn a little bit more about this. I'm going to show a few seconds of clips here and there. I was a college student at UC Berkeley when the 9/11 terrorist attacks took place. I think most people have a very vivid memory of what they were doing and where they were when the 9/11 attacks took place. And I remember my roommates waking me up and saying, you have to see this, and going into the living room and just seeing the plane crash over and over again into the World Trade Center, and the amount of like sadness and grief and mourning collectively that we did as students at Berkeley on campus. And of course, the effects afterwards, including Islamophobia, fear of Muslims. And at the time I was a Muslim, and fear of Arabs and attacks against people that weren't even Muslim, but people who weren't who were confused about Islam would often target people that were Sikhs, and a lot of grief and sadness and tension and heightened patriotism. So this is a very, very important event in American history. And let's take a look at a few pieces of footage.
The 11th, 2001 began like any other day in New York. This is the story of how it became a day that changed the world.
Okay, so you could take a look at this PBS documentary. I'm not going to show too much of it because we have more to learn. This is some of the footage that I told you was played over and over again on repeat.
Any kind of an effort up there yet. Now remember, oh my God.
That looks like a second plane.
Okay, so, okay. And then there are some other things I want to share with you that I have links up for to show you, but I don't want to spend too much time on this. So the September 11th attacks, what happened was Islamist. So be careful not to conflate or confuse together Islamic and Islamist. So Islamic people practice the religion of Islam. Islamists are people that want to see a state created that's an Islamic state, and they often have a very negative view of the West and a negative view of the United States for certain reasons. So Islamists and Islamic people, which we're not going to call them Islamic people, we're going to call them Muslim, are not the same. To be Muslim does not mean that you want to kill people or that you're a terrorist. So don't confuse that, because so many Americans do, and that causes xenophobia or fear of the other. It causes Islamophobia. So don't do that. Just if there's a Christian that does a terrorist attack, doesn't make all Christians terrorists. So we need to remember that and practice discernment. Okay, so hijackers, Islamist hijackers, are going to seize 4 planes. 2 of those planes are going to crash into the World Trade Centers, collapsing the 2 towers, causing about thousands of deaths. I want to say about 3,000, but I need to double check that. And then another plane later crashed into the Pentagon, and one other plane, a 4th plane, crashed into a field. It was headed for another landmark, but people on the plane stormed the hijackers and caused the plane to crash, preventing a 4th attack. We watched these events on television. Eventually, the United States was able to track these attacks to an Islamic militant named Osama bin Laden. This doesn't write down when he died, but he was later killed during the Obama administration. Here you can see President Obama on the death of Osama bin Laden.
Good evening. Tonight, I can report to the American people and to the world that the United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda, and a terrorist.
Okay, so you can watch more of these on your own. So this, just to update you, because it's not updated in your book. Okay, so because of these terrorist attacks, many political events will take place. One of those things is our president at the time, George W. Bush, who was related to the older George Bush that we've talked about in the past, declared war on terrorism, which is confusing because what does that mean? Are you declaring war on a specific country, or are you declaring war, like how do you declare war on a concept? And so that becomes complicated as well. Osama bin Laden was associated with an organization called Al-Qaeda, or the base, which is the core of a global terrorist network. It tells you more about him. He was actually very, very wealthy. He was sort of an estranged son of a Saudi rich man. And he eventually became associated with the Mujahideen. Remember them? They were supported by the United States in Afghanistan only because it was the Cold War. And during the Cold War, the United States supported anybody that wasn't a communist, even if that meant giving money and weapons to people like the Mujahideen, these Islamic warriors that were fighting the communists. And so in some ways, some people argue, and this is also something that's open for debate, I'm not saying that this is true, some people argue that the United States, in a way, led to the creation of Osama bin Laden by earlier supporting the Mujahideen. Now, of course, that's controversial. I'm not saying it's true. It's just a particular, if it could be oversimplified to state that. But of course, it's debatable. So anyway, after being supported by the United States, he later changed his mind on the United States and started to vilify the United States, especially because of its stance on Palestine, the bombing of Iraq, so many things. And so he basically started to have convictions that we needed to challenge the United States. Now, in addition to the war on terror, the United States is also going to attack Afghanistan. So you need to update or reflect your knowledge of Afghanistan. If you remember, Afghanistan was the site of a Soviet-backed coup, which embroiled the United States and the USSR in a proxy war. That eventually led to a civil war, and that civil war eventually led to a very conservative group called the Taliban taking over Afghanistan. And the Taliban, was very, very conservative. They were led by a mullah, a religious leader. They prevented women from exercising many rights. They had to be veiled. They made men eschew neckties and grow beards to reject Western values. And the United States didn't really recognize the Taliban as the official leaders of Afghanistan. Instead, they sided with a group called the Northern Alliance. Well, during the War on Terror, the United States government decided that they would no longer support any state that was harboring terrorists, and they basically started to support the Northern Alliance and the Northern Alliance as it fought against the Taliban. So basically, we went to war with Afghanistan, and this was in order to smash the Taliban and Al Qaeda, because supposedly the Taliban was providing a refuge for Al Qaeda terrorists like Osama bin Laden. Okay, that makes some sense. There's a connection there. What didn't make sense to a lot of people was the second war that was opened by the United States on Iraq, which is the country that I'm from. So this is an issue that's near and dear to my heart. So I've already taught this to you in another video, the one that says Chapter 39, Islamic Resurgence in Southwest Asia and North Africa. I taught you about the first Gulf War in Iraq and then the second Gulf War in Iraq, and how some people said there were weapons of mass destruction, but others claimed it was about oil. There are so many ways to think about it, but I'm going to close some of these tabs so it's not so distracting. You can go back and reference that video if you want a recap of the original Gulf War in Iraq and then the second Gulf War. So in his war on terror, Bush then started something called Operation Iraqi Freedom, because supposedly Saddam Hussein, the dictator at the time in Iraq, that had killed many people, many of his own people, Kurdish people, Shia people in the south, who in some points in history was supported by the United States. Saddam Hussein was supposedly affiliated with Al Qaeda and was stockpiling weapons of mass destruction. I showed you in that video how that was later disproved, but this was used to begin the war, the second war, Gulf War, on Iraq, led by coalition forces, largely made up of the United States and Britain and other countries, and basically attacked Iraq to try to oust Saddam Hussein from power. Unfortunately, this then led to clashes between the different groups in Iraq and destabilized the region. Eventually, Hussein is caught and hanged. That's something I mentioned in the previous video as well. There were a lot of casualties or deaths and a lot of cost to the United States for this operation. And it has long-lasting, still continuing, ongoing effects. And there are many people that also are concerned with this preemptive strike as setting a precedent for future attacks of the United States. They call this the Bush Doctrine of deterrence, because we weren't attacked by the United States, and yet we attacked that country for something that was later disproved. So it's a concern about future U.S. foreign policy, and it may have the effect of further fanning Islamist aspirations, because it may have caused some people to feel negative emotions towards the United States. Now, I was back in Iraq in 2018, and many people have a very positive view of the United States there now. But as you know, there is growing Islamist sentiment throughout the region. And so this is something that we need to be aware of as we study history and as we study current events.